Hi, I'm Alex Thompson. 3 weeks ago, my family cornered me at our country club and demanded I fork over what they called my pocket change inheritance from Great-Aunt Eleanor. My father actually laughed when he said it, like the whole thing was some kind of joke. My sister Jessica rolled her eyes and muttered something about finally putting the money to good use. They had it all planned out, you see. Jessica's fashion line was hemorrhaging cash, and apparently, my small inheritance was going to be her salvation. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 48 hours, Margaret Harrison, the president of First National Bank, would walk into that same country club dining room and announce that my pocket change was actually a $50 million trust that had been growing quietly for decades. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. I let them talk, I let them scheme. I sat there sipping my water while they carved up what they thought was mine, and when the moment was right, I watched their world crumble in real time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind carried the scent of burning leaves as I pulled into the circular driveway of the Harbor View Country Club. I'd driven this route from Hartford exactly 3 times in my adult life, each time for a funeral or some family obligation I couldn't gracefully avoid. The building stood like something out of a period drama, all weathered brick and ivy-covered walls, with tall windows that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in golden sheets. I sat in my Honda Civic for a moment, watching other cars glide past me toward valet parking. BMWs, Mercedes, the occasional Tesla. My car looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood, which honestly it had. I dressed carefully that morning, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I knew Jessica would find something to criticize if I didn't. Navy blazer, pressed khakis, loafers that weren't new but weren't falling apart either. Teaching high school didn't exactly come with a country club wardrobe budget, but I'd learned to make do. The invitation had been formal, printed on thick cream cardstock that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. The Thompson family requests your presence for a celebration of life luncheon honoring Eleanor Whitfield. It had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, which I'd attended alone while the rest of the family was apparently too busy to show up. The hostess recognized the Thompson name immediately and led me through a maze of dining rooms filled with the quiet murmur of expensive conversations. Crystal glasses clinked softly against china plates, and somewhere a pianist was working through jazz standards with the kind of skill that made it sound effortless. We passed oil paintings of sailing ships and old men in military uniforms, the kind of decor that whispered about money so old it had forgotten where it came from. The private dining room was tucked away in the back corner, and as the hostess opened the heavy wooden door, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came with Thompson family gatherings. They were all there, arranged around a mahogany table that could have seated 12 but somehow made our family of 7 look small and scattered. My father sat at the head, naturally, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the October wind outside. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, and his gold watch caught the light every time he gestured. My mother sat to his right, elegant in that effortless way that came from decades of practice, her pearl necklace resting just so against her cashmere sweater. She glanced up when I entered, offered a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and returned to adjusting her napkin. Jessica dominated the conversation from her spot near the window, gesturing with wine glass in hand as she described some Fashion Week disaster in Milan. At 28, she'd perfected the art of making everything sound both tragic and glamorous, a skill that served her well in her role as the family's perpetual victim. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, and she wore what I'd learned to recognize as investment pieces. A black dress that probably cost more than my rent, shoes that clicked authoritatively against hardwood floors, jewelry that caught light from angles I didn't know existed. She paused her story long enough to air-kiss my cheek and compliment my quaint blazer before diving back into her tale of European drama. Uncle Frank had claimed the spot across from my father, his bulk filling the chair like he was settling in for a business negotiation. He owned 3 car dealerships in Fairfield County and had the handshake and backslap personality that went with it. Aunt Patty sat beside him, scrolling through her phone with the distracted air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Their son Michael had positioned himself near the bar cart, already working on what looked like his second bourbon, despite the fact that it wasn't even noon yet. He nodded at me with the casual indifference we'd perfected over years of family gatherings, where we had nothing to say to each other. The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, opposite my father, like I was being positioned for interrogation rather than lunch. A water glass waited for me, along with a small salad that looked like it had been arranged by someone with an art degree. No wine, I noticed, though everyone else had crystal glasses filled with something that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week. The message was subtle but clear. I was here on sufferance, not as an equal. I settled into my chair and took a sip of water while conversation flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream. Jessica was explaining the collapse of her latest business venture.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
With the kind of dramatic flair that made bankruptcy sound like a creative choice. Something about a supplier in Italy who'd failed to deliver on time, a photographer who'd stolen her concepts, and landlords in Soho who clearly didn't understand artistic vision. Uncle Frank made appropriate sympathetic noises, while Aunt Patty continued scrolling. Michael stared into his bourbon like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't thought to ask yet. My mother finally cleared her throat with the delicate authority of someone accustomed to directing conversations. "Well," she said, setting down her wine glass with a soft clink, "I suppose we should discuss why we're all here." She glanced around the table with the expression of someone delivering news that everyone already knew but no one wanted to acknowledge. Eleanor's affairs have been settled, and as we all know, she left everything to Alex. The word everything hung in the air with a weight I didn't understand yet. Jessica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Uncle Frank leaned back in his chair with a small nod. Michael looked up from his bourbon with sudden interest. Even Aunt Patty stopped scrolling. My father folded his hands on the table in front of him with the precision of someone who'd practiced the gesture. "The amount isn't substantial," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used for board meetings. "Approximately $25,000, plus some jewelry and personal effects. Pocket change, really, in the grand scheme of things." He paused to let this sink in, then continued with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "But Jessica is in a difficult position right now, and we thought, as a family, we might discuss how best to support her." I took another sip of water and watched Jessica dab at her eyes with a napkin that probably cost more than most people's dinner. Her voice when she spoke carried just the right note of brave vulnerability. "I didn't want to ask," she said softly, glancing around the table for support. "But the lawyers are saying I might have to declare bankruptcy if I can't settle the outstanding debts. The whole brand could disappear." She looked directly at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine fear behind the performance. $25,000 would be enough to keep the doors open while I restructure. Uncle Frank leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone solving a puzzle. "It's really the smart play," he said, his car salesman instincts taking over. "Jessica's got potential for real success once she gets past this rough patch. Alex, you're doing fine with your teaching job. Steady income, good benefits. You don't really need the money." He spread his hands like he was presenting an obvious solution. "Why not help family when you can?" Aunt Patty looked up from her phone long enough to add, "It's what Eleanor would have wanted. She always said family should take care of family."
Oh.
This was news to me, considering Aunt Patty had spoken to Eleanor exactly twice in the last decade, both times at funerals. Michael swirled his bourbon and offered his contribution to the discussion. "Besides, what's a teacher going to do with 25 grand? Pay off student loans." He laughed at his own joke. "Jess could turn that into real money if she plays it right." I set my water glass down carefully and looked around the table. 7 people, all of them successful in their own ways, all of them convinced that my inheritance was somehow community property. I thought about Eleanor, alone in that big house in Greenwich, spending her last years collecting art and reading mystery novels, while her family wrote her off as the eccentric recluse who'd never married or had children. I thought about the monthly visits I'd made, not because anyone asked me to, but because she was the only member of the Thompson family who'd ever treated me like I had something interesting to say. My father was watching me with the patient expression of someone waiting for an obvious conclusion. "We've already spoken to David Chen," he said, mentioning the family lawyer. "The paperwork is straightforward, a simple transfer, and Jessica can get back on her feet." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. "We just need your signature." I looked at the paper without reaching for it. Around the table, 6 pairs of eyes watched me with varying degrees of expectation. Jessica's were bright with hope. Uncle Frank's carried the confidence of someone who'd never met a deal he couldn't close. My mother's held that particular blend of disappointment and resignation that had defined most of our interactions since I'd chosen teaching over business school. The pianist in the main dining room had moved on to something melancholy and complex, the notes drifting through the heavy door, like background music for a scene I didn't want to be in. Outside the window, I could see the harbor where boats bobbed at their moorings, their masts tracing lazy circles against the gray October sky. Everything about this place spoke of money, tradition, and the kind of family loyalty that always seemed to flow in one direction. I thought about the envelope waiting in my apartment back in Hartford, the one that had arrived from First National Bank 3 days ago, with instructions not to open it until the reading of Eleanor's will. I thought about the phone call from Margaret Harrison, the bank president, asking if I'd be available for a meeting early next week. I thought about Eleanor's last words to me, spoken in her hospital room just 2 days before she died. "Alex dear, I've made sure you'll be taken care of. But promise me something. Don't let them bully you into giving away what isn't theirs to take." I reached for my water glass again and took a long, slow sip. The ice had melted and the water tasted flat, metallic. When I set the glass down, the soft clink seemed louder than it should have been in the sudden quiet. "I need to think about it," I said finally. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of surprise and disappointment. Jessica's face crumpled slightly. Uncle Frank's eyebrows rose. My mother's lips compressed into a thin line of disapproval. My father's voice carried a note of strained patience. "Alex, this is family. There's nothing to think about." But there was everything to think about, and for the first time in my adult life, I was going to take the time to do it properly. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched salad, and stood up from the table. "I'll let you know my decision by the end of the week," I said, reaching for my jacket. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes following me, could sense the charged silence of people who'd expected one outcome and received something entirely different. Jessica's voice, small and wounded, followed me into the hallway. "I can't believe she's being so selfish." But I was already gone, walking past the oil paintings and crystal chandeliers, past the pianist and the whispered conversations, out into the October afternoon, where the air tasted like freedom and the future felt suddenly, unexpectedly wide open. The drive back to Hartford felt longer than usual, the October landscape blurring past my windows in shades of amber and rust. I kept replaying the scene at the country club, the way my father had presented that document like it was a foregone conclusion, the expectant faces around the table waiting for me to fall in line like I always had. My phone buzzed twice during the drive, text messages that I ignored. I knew without looking that they were from Jessica, probably alternating between guilt trips and dramatic pleas about her failing business. My apartment building sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees that were just beginning to shed their leaves. It wasn't much to look at, a converted Victorian that had been chopped up into 6 units, but it was mine. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors were quiet, and I had a small balcony that caught the morning sun. After 28 years of living in spaces that belonged to other people, having my own key to my own door still felt like a minor miracle. I climbed the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor, past Mrs. Rodriguez's door, where I could hear her television playing a Spanish soap opera, past the college student who practiced violin at odd hours. My apartment was at the end of the hall, and as I turned the key in the lock, I felt some of the tension from lunch begin to ease from my shoulders. The living room was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces I'd collected over the years from estate sales and thrift stores. Nothing matched exactly, but everything fit together in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. Eleanor had taught me that during one of our monthly visits, she gestured around her own eclectic living room and said, "Harmony doesn't require uniformity, dear. Sometimes the most beautiful rooms are the ones where everything belongs but nothing quite matches." I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and noticed the stack of mail I'd left there that morning. Bills mostly, and a few catalogs addressed to previous tenants, but there in the middle was the envelope from First National Bank. Thick cream-colored paper with my name typed across the front in formal business font. Margaret Harrison's return address embossed in dark blue ink. I'd been carrying it around for 3 days, following Eleanor's instructions not to open it until after the will reading, which had technically happened this morning at the lawyer's office, before lunch. The will reading itself had been anticlimactic. David Chen had gathered the family in his conference room, all dark wood and leather-bound law books, and read through Eleanor's final wishes in the measured tone of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The house would be sold, and the proceeds donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Various pieces of jewelry and personal items would go to different family members. And then, almost as an afterthought, he'd mentioned the financial accounts, all of which were being transferred to me. $25,000, he'd said, plus some savings bonds and a small investment account. Nothing substantial, he'd assured the room, just enough to handle final expenses and provide a modest inheritance. The family had nodded and murmured appropriate condolences in my direction, already moving on to discussions about cleaning out the house and whether any of Eleanor's art collection was worth keeping. But now, standing in my kitchen with the afternoon light slanting through the windows, I remembered something David Chen had said at the very end of the meeting. Almost as an afterthought, he'd mentioned that Eleanor had maintained her primary accounts at First National Bank, and that Margaret Harrison would be in touch to handle the transfer of funds. At the time, it had seemed like standard bureaucratic procedure. Now, looking at the envelope in my hands, I wondered if there was more to it. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down at my small dining table. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, and when I turned it over, I could see that the seal was pressed deep into the wax, like someone had taken extra care to make sure it stayed closed. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of letterhead, along with what looked like a legal document folded in thirds. The letter was brief and formal, written in the careful language that banks used when they wanted to sound important without actually saying anything. Margaret Harrison requested my presence at her office on Monday morning, at 10 o'clock, to discuss the Eleanor Whitfield estate and finalize the transfer of accounts. She mentioned that there were some additional documents that required my personal attention and suggested that I bring identification and any paperwork related to the inheritance. The legal document was more interesting. It appeared to be some kind of trust agreement, dense with legal terminology that made my head spin. I could make out Eleanor's name and mine, along with references to investment accounts, and something called a remainder trust that meant nothing to me. At the bottom of the last page, I found a handwritten note in Eleanor's distinctive script. "Alex dear, I hope you'll forgive an old woman's dramatic tendencies. I wanted to make sure you understood the full scope of what I'm leaving you before anyone else had a chance to complicate matters. Please read this carefully, and remember what I told you about not letting people take what isn't theirs. All my love, Eleanor." I read the note 3 times, trying to decipher what she meant by full scope. The trust document was full of financial jargon that I didn't understand, but I could see numbers scattered throughout the pages. Large numbers. Numbers with more zeros than made sense for a $25,000 inheritance. My phone rang, startling me out of my concentration. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail before deciding that avoiding her would only make things worse. I answered on the 4th ring. "Alex, thank God," she said, her voice carrying that breathless quality she used when she was particularly stressed. "I've been trying to reach you all afternoon. Listen, I know lunch was awkward, but I really need to talk to you about this inheritance thing." I leaned back in my chair and watched the shadows from the maple tree outside dance across my ceiling. "What's there to talk about, Jess? You need money, and you think I should give you mine. It's not that simple, and you know it." Her voice sharpened slightly, losing some of its carefully modulated vulnerability. "This isn't just about me, it's about family, it's about doing what's right." I almost laughed at that. Jessica had never shown much interest in doing what was right when it conflicted with doing what was convenient. "And what exactly is right about giving you money that Eleanor specifically left to me?" There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted into the patient voice she used when she thought she was dealing with someone who wasn't understanding the obvious. "Alex, $25,000 isn't going to change your life. You'll still have your job, your apartment, your little routine, but for me it could mean the difference between saving my business and losing everything I've worked for." I thought about Eleanor's note, about the trust document spread out on my table, about the meeting with Margaret Harrison on Monday morning. "Maybe there's more to this than you realize." "What do you mean?" I wasn't ready to share what I'd found, not until I understood it myself. "I mean, maybe Eleanor had reasons for leaving things the way she did." Jessica's laugh was sharp and bitter. Eleanor was 92 years old and lived alone with a bunch of cats and art books. She barely knew any of us. You visited her a few times, and suddenly you're her favorite. Please, the casual dismissal of Eleanor's life, of the months I'd spent sitting with her in that big house in Greenwich, listening to her stories about traveling through Europe as a young woman, helping her organize her art collection, driving her to doctor's appointments when she got too frail to drive herself, hit me harder than I'd expected. I visited her every month for 3 years, I said quietly. Not a few times. Every month. When did you last see her, Jess? Another pause, longer this time. That's not the point. I think it's exactly the point. I could hear her breathing change, the way it did when she was building up to one of her dramatic moments. Fine, you want to play the martyr, go ahead. But remember that the rest of us have actual responsibilities. Real problems. Not everyone gets to hide out in their little apartment grading papers and pretending the world doesn't exist. The line went dead, and I set my phone down on the table next to the trust documents. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, and I could hear the sounds of neighbors coming home from work, car doors slamming, footsteps on stairs, the comfortable noise of people settling into their evening routines. I spent the next 2 hours trying to make sense of the legal documents, looking up terms on my laptop, and slowly piecing together what appeared to be a complex financial arrangement. From what I could understand, Eleanor hadn't just left me a simple inheritance. She'd established some kind of trust that had been growing for years, possibly decades. The numbers I was seeing didn't make sense in the context of a $25,000 bequest. They looked more like, well, they looked like numbers that would require meetings with bank presidents rather than simple account transfers. Around 7 o'clock, I gave up trying to decipher legal language and made myself dinner. Something simple, pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market, eaten at my small table, while I watched the last of the daylight fade from the sky. I'd always found cooking meditative, the simple process of chopping and stirring, and seasoning helping to organize my thoughts when everything else felt chaotic. As I washed dishes, I thought about the conversation with Jessica, about the way she'd dismissed Eleanor's life as irrelevant, about the assumption that my inheritance was somehow community property. I thought about my father's confident presentation of the transfer paperwork, about Uncle Frank's car salesman enthusiasm for a deal that benefited everyone except me. I thought about the way they'd all looked at me when I said I needed to think about it, like I'd violated some unspoken family rule about knowing my place. But mostly I thought about Eleanor, about the last real conversation we'd had before she got too sick to talk much. We'd been sitting in her garden, despite the October chill, because she'd insisted she wanted to see her roses one more time. She'd wrapped herself in a thick blanket and watched me deadhead the last blooms of the season. Alex, she said suddenly, in the middle of a comfortable silence, what do you think about inheritance? I'd looked up from the roses, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean the idea that money and property should automatically pass to blood relatives, regardless of whether they've earned it or deserve it, or would use it wisely. She'd been watching me carefully, her pale blue eyes still sharp despite her illness. Do you think being related to someone gives you a claim on their assets? I'd considered the question seriously.
The way I always did when Eleanor asked me something. She had a way of posing philosophical questions that didn't have easy answers. I think it depends on the relationships involved. If you've invested time and love and care in someone, that should count for something. But just sharing DNA, I'm not sure that's enough. She'd nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. The Thompson family has very strong opinions about inheritance. They believe in bloodlines and birth order and traditional family structures. They think my money should go to Robert as the eldest nephew to be distributed according to his judgment. What do you think? Eleanor had smiled then, a mischievous expression that made her look decades younger. I think Robert hasn't spoken to me in 5 years except to ask about my health and whether I'd updated my will. I think Jessica visits when she needs something and ignores me the rest of the time. I think most of my family sees me as an obligation rather than a person. She'd reached over and patted my hand with fingers that felt delicate as bird bones. But you, my dear, you see me. You listen when I tell stories about my travels. You help me organize my art books and remember which paintings I bought where. You drive me to appointments and don't make me feel like a burden. That's worth more than blood, in my opinion. Now, standing in my kitchen 3 weeks after her funeral, I understood what she'd been trying to tell me. The inheritance wasn't just about money.
It was about recognition, about being seen and valued for who I was rather than what role I played in family dynamics. It was Eleanor's way of saying that love and care mattered more than genetics and birth order. I dried my hands and walked back to the dining table where the trust documents were still spread out like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't quite solved yet. Tomorrow I would call Margaret Harrison and try to schedule an earlier meeting. I needed to understand exactly what Eleanor had left me before I made any decisions about what to do with it. But tonight, for the first time since the family meeting at the country club, I felt like I had something more than just $25,000 to consider. I felt like I had Eleanor's trust in my judgment, her confidence that I would do the right thing with whatever she'd given me. And that felt like something worth protecting. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made Hartford feel like it was settling in for a long winter. I woke up earlier than usual, my mind immediately jumping to the trust documents and the upcoming meeting with Margaret Harrison. I'd called the bank first thing and managed to move my appointment up to Friday afternoon, claiming a scheduling conflict that was technically true if you counted my growing anxiety as a conflict. I taught my morning classes with half my attention on American literature and half on Eleanor's cryptic note about the full scope of my inheritance. During lunch break, I sat in my empty classroom grading papers and trying to concentrate on my students' essays about the Great Gatsby. There was something ironic about reading teenage interpretations of a story about old money and new money, while wondering exactly how much money Eleanor had actually left me. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Alex dear, your father and I would like to discuss the situation with Eleanor's bequest. Perhaps dinner this weekend." The formal tone, so different from her usual casual messages, told me everything I needed to know about the family's current mood. They weren't happy with my request for thinking time and they were mobilizing for a more serious conversation. I responded with a non-committal message about being busy this weekend, which was true enough. I had papers to grade, lessons to plan, and apparently a meeting with a bank president that might change everything. I wasn't ready for another family ambush until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The afternoon passed slowly, my last period seniors trudging through discussions of symbolism in literature, while I watched the clock and thought about trust funds and family expectations. By the time the final bell rang, I was so distracted that I nearly forgot to give out the homework assignment for the weekend. The drive to First National Bank took me through the heart of downtown Hartford, past the old State House and the modern office buildings that housed insurance companies and financial firms. The bank itself was an imposing granite structure that had probably been built in the 1920s, all columns and carved stonework that spoke of an era when banks were designed to inspire confidence through sheer architectural weight. Margaret Harrison's office was on the third floor, accessed through a maze of marble corridors and polished wood doors. Her secretary, a woman in her 50s with the kind of professional competence that made me immediately sit up straighter, escorted me through an outer office furnished with leather chairs and oil paintings of stern-looking men in suits. Margaret Harrison herself was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek bun and a navy suit that managed to look both authoritative and approachable. She stood up from behind a mahogany desk that could have doubled as a landing strip and extended her hand with a firm grip that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously. "Miss Thompson, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat." She gestured to a pair of leather chairs arranged around a small conference table near the windows. "I know this must be a confusing time for you, dealing with the loss of your great-aunt and the complexities of her estate." I settled into the chair and tried to project more confidence than I felt. "The lawyer mentioned that Eleanor maintained accounts here, but I have to admit I'm not entirely clear on the details." Margaret nodded and opened a thick file folder that had been waiting on the table. "That's understandable. Eleanor was very specific about how she wanted this information to be handled. She insisted that certain details not be disclosed until after the formal will reading, and that you be given time to process the initial bequest before learning about the additional arrangements." Additional arrangements. The phrase sent a flutter of anxiety through my chest. What kind of additional arrangements? Margaret pulled out a document that looked similar to the trust agreement I'd been struggling to understand. Eleanor established what's called a remainder trust in 1995, shortly after her father's death. She was quite young at the time, only in her 50s, but she was already thinking about how she wanted her assets distributed after her death. She spread the document out on the table between us, pointing to specific sections as she spoke. The trust was designed to grow over time through careful investment and reinvestment of dividends and interest.
Eleanor was very hands-on in the management, working closely with our investment team to build a diversified portfolio focused on long-term growth. I stared at the numbers on the page, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I don't understand. The lawyer said the inheritance was about $25,000. Margaret's expression shifted slightly, taking on the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that she knew would be shocking. The $25,000 represents Eleanor's checking and savings accounts, along with some certificates of deposit. The trust account is separate, and considerably larger. She turned to a different page, one filled with columns of numbers and investment terms that made my head spin. As of this morning's market close, the Eleanor Whitfield Remainder Trust has a total value of approximately $51.3 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my breath catch in my throat, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt slightly to one side. $51 million. Not $25,000. Not pocket change. $51 million. I'm sorry, I said, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. Did you say 51 million? Margaret nodded, her expression sympathetic but professional. I know it's a shock. Eleanor was very wealthy, much more so than most people realized. She lived modestly by choice, but she was an astute investor with a portfolio that included real estate, blue-chip stocks, and some very successful technology investments she made in the 1990s. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what I'd just heard. Eleanor, who drove a 15-year-old Volvo and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, who complained about the cost of heating her house and bought her clothes from department store sales, had been worth $50 million. And she'd left it all to me. Why didn't anyone know? I asked. I mean my family, the lawyers, everyone thinks this is a small inheritance. Margaret consulted her file again. Eleanor was very private about her wealth. She maintained separate accounts for her day-to-day expenses and her investment portfolio. Only a few people knew the full extent of her assets, and she specifically requested that the trust information not be shared with other family members until after you'd had a chance to understand the situation. She pulled out another document, this one clearly handwritten in Eleanor's distinctive script. She left specific instructions about how this information should be handled. She was quite concerned that you might face pressure from other family members if they knew the true scope of the inheritance. I thought about lunch at the country club, about my father's casual dismissal of the pocket change inheritance, about Jessica's dramatic pleas for financial rescue. They had no idea. None of them had any idea what Eleanor had actually left me. What happens now? I asked. Margaret opened another section of the file. That depends on what you want to do. The trust is set up so that you have complete control over the assets. You can leave everything invested and live off the dividends, which would provide a substantial annual income. You can liquidate portions of the portfolio for specific purposes. You can donate to charity, invest in new ventures, or simply maintain the status quo. The choice is entirely yours. She paused and looked at me directly. Eleanor did include one request, though it's not legally binding. She hoped that you would use some portion of the inheritance to pursue your interests and dreams, rather than simply maintaining the investments. She mentioned that you'd talked about wanting to travel, to write, to perhaps start a small school or educational foundation. I remembered those conversations, lazy afternoons in Eleanor's garden, when she'd asked me about my dreams and aspirations. I told her about wanting to see the places she'd described from her own travels, about ideas I had for innovative teaching methods, about stories I wanted to write someday, when I had the time and financial freedom to focus on creativity, rather than survival. She also, Margaret continued, consulting the handwritten note, specifically requested that you not feel obligated to share this windfall with family members who had never invested time or care in your relationship. She was quite firm about that point. I sat in the leather chair in Margaret Harrison's office, surrounded by mahogany and marble, and the quiet hum of serious money, and tried to absorb the reality of what I'd just learned. $51 million. Enough money to change everything, to never worry about rent or groceries, or whether I could afford to fix my car when it inevitably broke down. Enough money to make me, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. But more than that, it was Eleanor's final gift of freedom. Freedom from family expectations, from the assumption that I would always be the one who gave in, who compromised, who put everyone else's needs ahead of my own. She'd given me the power to choose my own path, and she'd made sure I understood that the choice was mine alone to make. Margaret was watching me with the patience of someone who delivered this kind of news before. I know it's a lot to take in. Why don't you take some time to think about everything, and we can schedule another meeting next week to discuss the specifics of managing the accounts. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She handed me a business card and a sealed envelope. Eleanor asked me to give you this when you learned about the trust. She said it would help explain her reasoning. I took the envelope and slipped it into my purse. Whatever Eleanor's final message said, I wanted to read it in private, away from the formality of the bank and the weight of Margaret Harrison's professional attention. As I walked back through the marble corridors and out into the October afternoon, I felt like I was moving through a different world than the one I'd entered an hour earlier. The same gray sky, the same bustling downtown streets, the same Honda Civic waiting in the parking garage. But everything had changed, in ways I was only beginning to understand. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of traffic and autumn colors. I felt disconnected from the ordinary world around me, like I was carrying a secret so large it might spill out if I wasn't careful. $51 million. The number kept echoing in my head, impossible and real at the same time. Back in my apartment, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at my dining table with Eleanor's final letter. The envelope was addressed simply to my dear Alex in her familiar handwriting. Inside, 3 pages of cream-colored stationery, covered in the careful script of someone who'd learned to write when penmanship mattered. My dearest Alex, the letter began, if you're reading this, then Margaret has told you about the trust, and you're probably feeling overwhelmed and possibly a bit frightened. That's perfectly normal. I felt the same way when I inherited my father's estate all those years ago, though I was much older than you are now, and had more time to prepare for the responsibility. I want you to understand why I structured things this way, why I kept the trust secret from the rest of the family, why I chose you to inherit what I've spent decades building. It's not because you're my favorite, though you are, and it's not because I disapprove of the others, though I often do. It's because you're the only one who ever saw me as a person rather than a problem to be managed, or an asset to be inherited. You listened to my stories without checking your watch. You helped me organize my books, because you understood that my art collection was important to me, not because you thought it might be valuable. You drove me to doctor's appointments, and never made me feel like I was imposing on your time. Most importantly, you never asked me about my will or my finances, or what I planned to leave to whom. You were content to know me as I was, rather than as what I might give you. That kind of genuine care is rare, my dear, and it deserves to be rewarded. But more than that, I believe you'll use this inheritance wisely. Not just the money itself, but the freedom it represents. You've spent your adult life being responsible, being reliable, being the one who takes care of others, without asking for anything in return. Now I want you to take care of yourself. Travel. Write. Teach in new ways. Start that school you talked about. Give yourself permission to dream bigger than a Hartford apartment and a public school salary. You have the kindest heart and the strongest character of anyone in the Thompson family, and I want to see what you'll do when you don't have to worry about money anymore. As for the others, well, I'm sure they'll have opinions about my decisions. They'll probably try to convince you that family loyalty requires you to share what I've given you. Don't listen to them. Robert has had 30 years to build a relationship with me, and chose not to. Jessica has had her entire adult life to show me that she values anything beyond what I might do for her financially. The rest of them have treated me like an obligation for decades. You don't owe them anything, Alex. Not explanation, not justification, and certainly not money. What you owe is to yourself, and to the memory of our friendship. Use this gift to become the person you've always had the potential to be, but never had the freedom to explore. I love you, dear girl, and I'm proud of the woman you've become. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for accepting what I've freely given. All my love, Eleanor. P.S. The blue jewelry box in my bedroom contains some family pieces that I've left to you as well. They're not particularly valuable, but they have sentimental meaning. Hidden in the false bottom of that box, you'll find the key to a safety deposit box at First National. Margaret has the details, but I wanted you to have the key directly from me. Inside you'll find some additional documents, and a few more personal items I thought you might treasure. I read the letter 3 times, my tea growing cold as Eleanor's words sank in. She'd thought of everything, anticipated every argument my family might make, every guilt trip they might attempt. She'd given me not just money, but permission to use it without shame or obligation. The mention of the jewelry box reminded me that I needed to go to the house in Greenwich at some point to collect Eleanor's personal items. David Chen had given me the keys and told me I could take my time going through her belongings. Now I understood why Eleanor had been specific about certain items being left to me personally, rather than simply added to the estate. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, and I could hear my neighbors coming home from work, the familiar sounds of doors closing and televisions turning on. Everything seemed normal and ordinary, but I felt like I was seeing it all from a great distance, like I was no longer quite part of the everyday world of rent payments and grocery budgets, and worrying about whether my car would pass inspection. My phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. "Alex, I really need to talk to you. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? This whole situation is becoming urgent." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm still thinking things through. I'll be in touch next week." It wasn't much of a delay, but it would give me time to process everything I'd learned, to decide how I wanted to handle what was coming next. Because I had no doubt that once my family learned the truth about Eleanor's inheritance, everything was about to become much more complicated. Saturday morning arrived, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Hartford feel like a postcard. I woke up with Eleanor's letter still on my nightstand, and the impossible reality of $51 million sitting in my consciousness, like a weight I hadn't learned how to carry yet. I made coffee and sat by my kitchen window, watching joggers and dog walkers navigate the sidewalk below, while I tried to process the magnitude of what had happened in Margaret Harrison's office. My phone had been unusually quiet since I'd put off Jessica's request for coffee, but I knew that wouldn't last. The Thompson family didn't accept delays gracefully, especially when money was involved. I'd learned that lesson early, watching how quickly family gatherings could turn into strategy sessions when there was something to be gained or protected. Around 10 o'clock, I drove out to Greenwich to collect the items Eleanor had left me personally. The house sat on a tree-lined street, where every property spoke of old money and careful maintenance, the kind of neighborhood where landscapers arrived in crews, and no one ever had to worry about mortgage payments. Eleanor's Victorian was painted a soft yellow with white trim, surrounded by gardens that even in late October showed evidence of decades of careful tending. I let myself in through the front door, using the keys David Chen had given me, and stepped into the silence of a house that was no longer anyone's home. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books, scents that brought Eleanor back so vividly, I had to pause in the hallway and catch my breath. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, down to the reading glasses folded neatly on the hall table, and the bookmark protruding from a mystery novel she'd never had the chance to finish. The blue jewelry box was exactly where Eleanor had said it would be, sitting on her bedroom dresser, between a silver-framed photograph of her parents and a small crystal vase that held the dried remains of roses from her garden. The box itself was beautiful, lacquered wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl designs that caught the light from the bedroom windows. Inside, I found the necklaces and bracelets that Eleanor had mentioned, pieces that looked like they'd been in the family for generations. The false bottom was cleverly concealed, accessible only when you knew to press on a specific corner of the interior. Underneath, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small brass key attached to a velvet ribbon. Along with it, another note in Eleanor's handwriting. The safety deposit box contains documents related to some of my art purchases, as well as a few pieces of jewelry that belonged to my grandmother. I thought you might appreciate having something that connects you to the women who came before, even if you didn't know them personally. I slipped the key into my purse and spent the next hour walking through the house, collecting the few personal items that Eleanor had specifically left to me. A first edition of Jane Austen that we'd discussed during one of our visits. A small oil painting of the Greenwich Harbor that she'd bought during her travels in Europe. A photo album filled with pictures from her younger years, when she'd been bold enough to travel alone through countries where single women weren't expected to venture. As I was preparing to leave, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see my father's Mercedes, parked behind my Honda, and my stomach immediately tensed. He was walking toward the front door with the purposeful stride of someone who expected to be in charge of whatever situation he encountered. I opened the door before he could knock, hoping to keep the conversation on the front porch rather than inside Eleanor's house. "Dad, I wasn't expecting to see you here." He looked past me into the hallway, taking in the boxes I'd packed and the personal items I'd collected. "I thought you might be here today. David Chen mentioned that you were responsible for clearing out Eleanor's personal effects. His tone was neutral, but I could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed what I was taking and what might be left behind. Just the things she specifically left to me, I said, not moving aside to let him in. The estate sale company will handle the rest. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on the jewelry box tucked under my arm. I wanted to talk to you about our conversation yesterday. About Jessica's situation and the inheritance. I should have expected this. My father had never been the type to simply accept a delayed decision, especially not when he'd already decided what the outcome should be. I told you I needed time to think about it. And I respect that, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But I also think you might not fully understand the complexity of what Jessica is facing. This isn't just about a failed business venture. There are legal implications, potential lawsuits, her reputation in the fashion industry. $25,000 could literally save her career. I thought about the $51 million sitting in investment accounts that he didn't know existed, about Eleanor's letter warning me about exactly this kind of pressure, and what about my career? My life, my plans for the money? His expression shifted slightly, taking on the patient tone he used when he thought someone was being unreasonable. Alex, you're a teacher, you have job security, health insurance, a pension plan. You don't have the same financial pressures that Jessica faces as an entrepreneur. The casual dismissal of my profession, of my life choices, hit exactly the way it always had. In my father's world, teaching wasn't a real career, it was
something you did while you waited for a husband to provide real financial stability. Never mind that I'd chosen education because I was passionate about it, because I found meaning in helping students discover their own potential. So because I chose a stable career, I don't deserve to benefit from my inheritance. That's not what I'm saying. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like he was sharing a confidence. I'm saying that family means making sacrifices for each other. Your grandmother understood that. Your mother understands it. Even Eleanor, in her own way, understood it when she left money to family rather than to charity. The mention of Eleanor sparked something defensive in my chest. Eleanor left the money to me specifically, not to the family. To me. And we're proud of that recognition, he said smoothly. But surely you understand that with privilege comes responsibility. You have an opportunity to help your sister rebuild her life, to strengthen the family bond. $25,000 is a small price to pay for that kind of unity. I realized he was working from a script, using the same persuasion techniques that had made him successful in business. The appeal to family loyalty, the minimization of the amount involved, the suggestion that refusing would be selfish and small-minded. What he didn't know was that the amount wasn't small, wasn't insignificant, wasn't pocket change at all. I need more time, I said again. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How much time? As much as I need. We stood on Eleanor's front porch in the October sunlight, two people who shared DNA and a last name but seemed to be speaking entirely different languages. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. I brought the transfer paperwork with me, he said. Just in case you'd reconsidered. It really is a simple process. I looked at the papers without taking them. Did it occur to you that pressuring me might not be the best way to get what you want? I'm not pressuring you. I'm trying to help you understand the situation. By ambushing me at Eleanor's house with legal documents, his expression hardened. By trying to prevent you from making a decision you'll regret. Jessica is family, Alex. When you turn your back on family, you end up alone. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Comply, or face exclusion from the only family connections I had. It was a variation of the same manipulation I'd watched him use my entire life, the way he'd convinced my mother to give up her art career to support his business ambitions, the way he'd pressured cousins and siblings into family investments that always seemed to benefit him more than anyone else. I'll keep that in mind, I said, stepping back toward the door. He held out the papers one more time. Just think about what Eleanor would have wanted. She loved this family, even when she kept herself apart from it. I almost laughed at that. Eleanor, who had spent the last 3 years telling me exactly what she thought about the Thompson family's priorities and values. Eleanor, who had structured her inheritance specifically to avoid this kind of manipulation. Eleanor, who had trusted me to make my own decisions without interference from people who saw her money as a solution to their problems. I will, I said. I'll think about what Eleanor would have wanted. After he left, I sat in Eleanor's living room for another hour, surrounded by the books and artwork that had defined her life. The contrast between her quiet, thoughtful existence and my family's loud demands for attention and resources felt starker than ever. She had lived according to her own values, made her own choices, defined success on her own terms. And she had given me the tools to do the same. Sunday passed quietly. I graded papers, planned lessons for the upcoming week, and avoided my phone as much as possible. The few texts I received from family members were variations on the same theme. Jessica's urgent need, the family's expectation of unity, the assumption that I would eventually do the right thing. None of them acknowledged that the right thing might be respecting Eleanor's specific wishes about how her money should be used. Monday morning brought rain and a stack of essays about symbolism in The Great Gatsby that seemed particularly relevant given my current circumstances. My students had written about the green light representing hope and longing, about the contrast between old money and new money, about the corruption that came with inherited wealth. I found myself wondering what they would think about a teacher who had suddenly inherited more money than most of them would see in their lifetimes. During my lunch break, I called Margaret Harrison to schedule a visit to Eleanor's safety deposit box. She arranged to meet me at the bank that afternoon, and I spent the rest of the day distracted by curiosity about what Eleanor had considered important enough to store separately from her other valuables. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, and it took both keys, Margaret's master key and Eleanor's personal key, to open it. Inside, I found a collection of documents and objects that told the story of a life lived with purpose and intention. Deeds to properties I hadn't known Eleanor owned. Stock certificates for companies that had been purchased decades ago and grown into major corporations. Insurance policies and investment records that painted a picture of careful financial planning spanning nearly 40 years. But it was the personal items that moved me most. A strand of pearls that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, along with a photograph of a young woman wearing them at what looked like a debutante ball in the 1920s. A bundle of letters tied with ribbon, written in a man's handwriting and dated from the early 1960s. A small oil painting, no bigger than my hand, signed by an artist whose name I didn't recognize, but whose style seemed familiar from Eleanor's art collection. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in velvet, was a ring. Not an engagement ring or a family heirloom, but something more personal. A simple gold band set with a small emerald, accompanied by a note in Eleanor's handwriting. This belonged to my dear friend Catherine, who taught me that family is something you choose, not something you're born into. I wore it for 40 years after she died, as a reminder that love takes many forms. I hope you'll think of us both when you wear it. Margaret waited patiently, while I examined each item, making notes about insurance coverage and storage options for the more valuable pieces. When I was finished, she helped me return everything to the box except for the ring, which I slipped onto my right hand. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for me. Eleanor was quite specific about the timing of all this. Margaret said, as we left the vault area, she wanted you to understand the full scope of your inheritance gradually, so you wouldn't be overwhelmed by everything at once. I thought about the $51 million, about the properties and investments I'd just discovered, about the ring on my finger that represented a love story I was only beginning to understand. I think I'm getting overwhelmed anyway. Margaret smiled. That's normal. Most people never have to deal with this level of financial complexity. That's why we have trust officers and investment advisors and tax specialists. You don't have to figure it all out by yourself. As I drove back to Hartford, I realized that Margaret was right about more than just the financial complexity. Eleanor had given me more than money. She'd given me choices I'd never had before, freedom I'd never imagined possible, and the responsibility to decide how to use both wisely. But she'd also given me a problem I wasn't sure how to solve, how to protect what she'd left me from a family that saw it as communal property rather than personal inheritance. Tuesday morning brought the first real crisis. I was in the middle of teaching my second period class when my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Jessica. Emergency, Dad's calling a family meeting tonight. Says you're being unreasonable about the inheritance. Please call me before you decide anything permanent. I finished the class period on autopilot, my mind racing through possibilities. What did she mean by anything permanent? Had my father somehow found out about the trust? Was the family planning some kind of intervention or confrontation? During my planning period, I called Jessica back. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with stress. Thank God. Alex, I don't know what you said to Dad on Saturday, but he's furious.
He's convinced you're planning to do something spiteful with Eleanor's money. Spiteful like what? Like donate it to charity, or spend it on yourself instead of helping family. Her voice rose slightly. He's talking about having you declared incompetent to handle financial decisions. He says Eleanor was too old to make rational choices about her will, and that you might have influenced her. The threat hit me like cold water. A competency hearing. Legal challenges to Eleanor's will. The family turning Eleanor's generous gift into a public battle over money and family loyalty. I thought about Margaret Harrison's professional demeanor, about the careful legal documents Eleanor had prepared, about the investment advisors and tax specialists who could testify to Eleanor's mental clarity and financial sophistication. Jessica, Eleanor was 92, not 92 and demented. She was sharp as a tack until the day she died. I know that and you know that, but Dad's really upset. He thinks you're being manipulated by grief or something. He's already talked to a lawyer about options for challenging the will. I sat in my empty classroom, staring at the motivational posters about the power of education and the importance of following your dreams, and realized that my family was about to make those dreams much more complicated to achieve. What do you want me to do? I asked. Come to dinner tonight. Talk to him, show him that you're thinking clearly, and that you understand family responsibility. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. Alex, I really am in trouble. Not just the business stuff. There are people I owe money to who aren't as patient as banks and credit card companies. If I can't start making payments soon, she didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Jessica hadn't just made bad business decisions. She'd gotten involved with the kind of lenders who expected payment regardless of circumstances. How much trouble are we talking about? Enough that $25,000 would buy me breathing room to figure out a real solution. Enough that without it, I might have to leave the state. I closed my eyes and tried to think clearly. Jessica might be dramatic and self-centered, but she was still my sister. And if she was really in the kind of danger she was implying, then family loyalty might actually matter more than Eleanor's wishes about financial independence. But then I thought about Eleanor's letter, about her warning that the family would try to use guilt and obligation to claim what she'd given me freely. About her trust in my judgment, and her hope that I would use the inheritance to build a life defined by my own choices, rather than other people's expectations. I'll come to dinner, I said finally. But I'm not promising anything beyond listening. That's all I'm asking for. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Jessica was asking for much more than she admitted, and that my father was planning to demand much more than I was prepared to give. Tonight's family meeting wasn't going to be a discussion, it was going to be an ultimatum. The rain had stopped by the time I left school, but the sky remained gray and threatening, like it couldn't decide whether to clear or storm. I drove home slowly, trying to prepare for what was likely to be the most difficult conversation of my adult life. In a few hours I would sit down with my family, and try to explain why I couldn't give them money they thought belonged to them by right. And I would have to do it without revealing that the amount they were demanding was less than 1/10% of what Eleanor had actually left me. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were threatening legal action over $25,000, while I sat on an inheritance that could buy Jessica's fashion business 10 times over. But Eleanor had been clear about her reasoning, and her letter had been specific about not letting family pressure override my own judgment. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I made a decision. Tonight I would listen to what my family had to say. I would let them make their arguments, and present their case for why Eleanor's money should be redistributed according to their priorities, rather than her wishes. And then I would tell them no, clearly and finally, and deal with whatever consequences followed. Because Eleanor had given me more than money, she had given me the power to choose my own path, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me, even if it meant losing the only family I had ever known. The Thompson family home sat on Maple Street like a monument to suburban success, all brick and bay windows, and carefully maintained landscaping that spoke of regular professional care. I had grown up in that house, learned to ride a bike in that driveway, spent countless hours in the backyard reading under the old oak tree that still dominated the corner of the property. But tonight, pulling into the familiar driveway, it felt more like approaching a fortress than coming home. My parents had moved here when Jessica and I were young, trading up from a smaller house in a less prestigious neighborhood, as my father's insurance business grew and prospered. It was the kind of house that was designed to impress, with its grand foyer and formal dining room, and living spaces that were more about showcasing success than encouraging actual living. My mother had spent years decorating and redecorating, creating rooms that looked like they belonged in magazines, rather than real family life. I sat in my car for a moment before going in, watching the warm light spill from the windows, and trying to center myself for what was coming. Through the dining room window, I could see figures moving around the table, the familiar choreography of a family dinner being prepared. For a moment I felt a pang of nostalgia for simpler times, when family gatherings were about celebrating holidays, or birthdays rather than negotiating financial arrangements. My mother answered the door with a smile that was warmer than I'd expected, pulling me into a hug that smelled of her expensive perfume, and the roast beef she'd been preparing. "Sweetheart, I'm so glad you came. I was worried about you after your conversation with your father on Saturday." The house smelled like Sunday dinners from my childhood, all savory richness and baking bread, but underneath the familiar comfort I could sense the tension that came with family meetings disguised as social occasions. My father's voice carried from the living room, where he was talking to someone on the phone, his tone carrying the authority he used for business calls that couldn't be delayed even for family time. Jessica emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine, and for the first time in weeks she looked genuinely happy to see me. She was dressed more casually than usual, jeans and a sweater instead of her typical designer armor, and her makeup was understated enough that I could see the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and genuine worry. "Alex, thank you for coming," she said, and I heard real gratitude in her voice, rather than the performative emotion she usually deployed. "I know this whole situation is awkward, but I really appreciate you being willing to talk about it." Uncle Frank was already seated at the dining room table, along with Aunt Patty and Michael, creating the same configuration we'd had at the country club, but with different emotional undertones. This wasn't the formal ambush of the other day. This felt more like a family intervention, complete with concerned expressions, and the kind of gentle pressure that was supposed to feel supportive rather than coercive. My father joined us as my mother brought out the food, and for a few minutes we maintained the fiction that this was just a regular family dinner. Conversation stayed light, focused on work and weather, and safe topics that wouldn't trigger any of the underlying tensions. But I could feel the weight of unspoken expectations hanging over the table, like storm clouds waiting to break. It was Uncle Frank who finally brought up the elephant in the room, in his characteristic direct style that cut through polite pretense. "Alex, I know we've all been putting pressure on you about Eleanor's bequest, and I want you to know that comes from a place of caring about the family, not just about the money." My father nodded approvingly at this opening. "We've been thinking about this situation from all angles, and we realize we may have been too focused on Jessica's immediate needs, without considering your feelings about the inheritance." This was a different approach than I'd expected, more collaborative and less demanding. I found myself wondering if someone had coached them on more effective persuasion techniques, or if they'd simply realized that their previous strategy wasn't working. "The thing is," my mother added gently, "we're concerned about you handling this kind of financial decision on your own. Not because we don't trust your judgment, but because $25,000 is a significant amount for someone on a teacher's salary. We want to make sure you have support and guidance." The implication was clear. I was too inexperienced and financially naive to manage my inheritance responsibly without family oversight. It was a more subtle variation of the competency challenge Jessica had warned me about, wrapped in concern for my well-being, rather than outright accusations of poor judgment. "What kind of support are you thinking about?" I asked. "Well," my father said, setting down his fork with the careful precision that usually preceded his most important business points, "we thought it might make sense to establish a family trust. Pool Eleanor's bequest with some other family assets, let professional managers handle the investments, and distribute the income according to current family needs." Aunt Patty leaned forward with enthusiasm. "It's actually a smart tax strategy. And it would ensure that the money stays in the family long term, instead of being spent impulsively." I almost choked on my water at the phrase, "spent impulsively." The family that had pressured me to immediately hand over my inheritance was now concerned about impulsive spending. "Jessica's situation is urgent," Michael added, gesturing with his wine glass, "but there might be other family needs down the road. Medical expenses, education costs, business opportunities. A trust structure would let us respond to those needs as they arise." I realized they had thought this through much more carefully than their previous approach suggested. Instead of simply demanding that I give Jessica the money, they were proposing a system that would put my inheritance under family control, while maintaining the fiction that I still had a say in how it was used. How would decisions be made about distributions? I asked. Majority vote of the trustees, my father replied smoothly. All the adults in the family would have equal input. Equal input, except that I was the only one contributing assets to this hypothetical trust, while 6 other people would have equal authority over how those assets were used. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, presented as family cooperation and shared responsibility. Jessica had been quiet throughout this presentation, but now she spoke up with what seemed like genuine emotion. Alex, I know this all sounds complicated, but I want you to know that I don't expect you to solve my problems for me. If we do this family trust thing, I'll pay back whatever I borrow. With interest, I just need time to get back on my feet. There was something in her voice that made me look at her more closely. Behind the makeup and the careful presentation, I could see real fear. Whatever trouble she was in, it was serious enough to make her genuinely humble, which was not an emotion I associated with my sister. What exactly is the timeline we're talking about? I asked. I need to make a payment by Friday, she said quietly. If I can't, then things get complicated in ways that go beyond just business problems. My father's expression tightened slightly at this admission. Whatever Jessica had told him about her situation, it apparently hadn't included the full details about the nature of her debts. How complicated? I pressed. Jessica glanced around the table, clearly uncomfortable with the level of specificity I was requesting. Let's just say that some of my creditors aren't the kind of people who accept excuses or payment plans. The silence that followed this revelation was thick with implications. Uncle Frank shifted in his chair. Aunt Patty stopped eating entirely. My mother's face went pale as she processed what Jessica was really saying. Jessica, my father said carefully, are you telling us that you've borrowed money from illegal lenders? Not illegal exactly, she said quickly. But not traditional banks either. People who invest in high-risk businesses with expectation of high returns. Michael leaned back in his chair, with the expression of someone who was suddenly very glad he hadn't invested in his cousin's fashion ventures. Jesus, Jess. How much are we talking about? Enough that $25,000 would cover the immediate payment and buy me time to arrange something more sustainable. I sat at my parents' dining room table, surrounded by the family I'd grown up with, and realized that everything had just changed. This wasn't about family unity, or shared responsibility, or even Jessica's business dreams. This was about physical safety, and the consequences of financial decisions that had spiraled far beyond bad judgment into genuinely dangerous territory. But even as I felt sympathy for Jessica's predicament, I couldn't shake Eleanor's words about not letting family guilt override my own judgment. The trust proposal was still a way of taking control of my inheritance, regardless of the circumstances that made it seem necessary. And Eleanor had been specific about not feeling obligated to solve problems that weren't of my making. I need to ask you something, I said, looking directly at Jessica. If I were to help you with this immediate payment, what would prevent you from ending up in the same situation 6 months from now? I've learned my lesson, she said quickly. That's not an answer, that's a hope. My father intervened, with the smooth authority he used to regain control of difficult conversations. Alex, I think you're overthinking this. Family helps family, especially in crisis situations. We can work out the details of long-term financial planning after we deal with the immediate emergency. But I wasn't overthinking it. If anything, I was finally thinking clearly. For the first time since this whole situation began, Eleanor had given me the resources to help Jessica, if I chose to, but she had also given me the wisdom to recognize manipulation disguised as emergency. I'll consider the family trust proposal, I said finally. But I need time to review it with my own financial advisor. The relief around the table was immediate and visible. My mother smiled for the first time all evening. Jessica's shoulders relaxed. Uncle Frank nodded approvingly, at what he interpreted as a reasonable compromise. But my father's eyes remained calculating, and I realized he had heard something in my response that the others had missed. I wasn't agreeing to their proposal. I was buying time while I figured out how to protect what Eleanor had given me, without completely destroying my relationship with the only family I had. As the evening wound down and conversation moved to safer topics, I thought about the ring on my finger, and Eleanor's note about family being something you choose rather than something you're born into. In a few days, I would have to
make a choice that would define not just my financial future but my understanding of what family loyalty really meant. The question wasn't whether I could afford to help Jessica. With $51 million, I could solve her immediate problems without even noticing the expense. The question was whether helping her was the right thing to do and whether Eleanor's trust in my judgment had been well placed or naive. By the time I left my parents' house that night, I knew that whatever decision I made would have consequences that reached far beyond money. I was about to learn whether choosing my own path was worth the price of losing the family that had shaped me for better and worse my entire life. Wednesday morning arrived with an email from my father that was marked urgent and contained a single attachment: the family trust documents they'd discussed at dinner. I opened it while drinking my coffee and realized they'd had the legal paperwork prepared before our conversation even took place. The trust structure was exactly as they'd described it, complete with trustee roles for each family member and distribution guidelines that essentially turned my inheritance into a communal resource managed by committee vote. What struck me most was the speed with which they'd moved from emotional appeals to legal documents. This wasn't a family trying to support each other through a crisis. This was a business transaction disguised as concern, complete with terms and conditions that heavily favored everyone except the person contributing the assets. I spent my morning classes distracted, thinking about Eleanor's warnings and the growing pressure from my family. During lunch, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I called Margaret Harrison and asked if she could arrange an emergency meeting that afternoon. It was time to stop pretending that $25,000 was the only number that mattered in this equation. Margaret squeezed me into her schedule at 3 o'clock, and I spent the drive to Hartford rehearsing what I wanted to say. By the time I reached her office, I had crystallized my thoughts into a simple question: what would Eleanor have done if her family had tried to manipulate her into giving away her inheritance? "I need your advice," I said, as soon as Margaret closed her office door. "My family is pressuring me to put Eleanor's bequest into a family trust that they would control. They don't know about the actual size of the inheritance, and they're threatening legal action if I don't comply with their demands." Margaret's expression grew serious as I explained the family dinner, the trust proposal, and Jessica's dangerous financial situation. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking for clarification about specific threats or timeline demands. "What they're proposing isn't illegal," she said when I finished. "Family trusts are legitimate financial structures, and if you agreed to participate, it would be a valid way to manage assets. But Eleanor was very specific about wanting you to have complete control over your inheritance. She anticipated exactly this kind of family pressure." Margaret opened Eleanor's file and pulled out a document I hadn't seen before. Eleanor actually prepared contingency instructions for several scenarios, including family challenges to the will and attempts to pressure you into redistributing the assets. She gave me specific authorization to take certain steps if those situations arose. She handed me the document, which was written in Eleanor's careful handwriting and dated just 2 months before her death. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means my family is trying to claim what I've given you freely. I want you to know that I prepared for this possibility, and I've given Margaret the tools to protect you from their manipulation." The letter continued with instructions that made my breath catch in my throat. Eleanor had not only anticipated my family's behavior, she had created a legal framework to counter it. She had prepared sworn affidavits from her doctors confirming her mental capacity at the time she created the trust. She had video testimony explaining her reasoning for the inheritance structure. She had even arranged for character witnesses who could testify to my integrity and her satisfaction with my care during her final years. She also, Margaret said, pulling out another folder, established what's called a defensive trust. If anyone challenges your right to inherit her assets, the trust automatically triggers additional protections, including immediate distribution of funds to accounts that can't be accessed through legal challenges. I stared at the documents spread across Margaret's desk and realized that Eleanor had been playing chess while my family was playing checkers. She had anticipated their moves and prepared counter-moves that would not only protect my inheritance but potentially expose their manipulation tactics to legal scrutiny. "What does this mean practically?" I asked. "It means you have choices they don't know about. If you want to help Jessica with her immediate crisis, you can do that from a position of strength rather than giving in to family pressure. If you want to tell them about the actual size of your inheritance, you have legal protections in place. If you want to maintain the fiction that you only inherited $25,000, Eleanor's structure allows you to do that too. Margaret paused and looked at me directly. But most importantly, it means you don't have to make decisions based on fear of what they might do to you legally. Eleanor made sure you have more resources and better legal protection than they could possibly challenge. I spent the next hour reviewing Eleanor's defensive strategies and marveling at the depth of her planning. She had thought through scenarios I hadn't even considered, preparing responses to family tactics I wouldn't have anticipated. But more than the legal protections, what struck me was the care with which she had tried to shield me from exactly the kind of pressure I was currently experiencing. As I drove back to my apartment, I realized that Eleanor had given me something more valuable than money or legal protection. She had given me permission to choose my own response to family manipulation without fear of consequences. For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt like I had power rather than just problems. That evening I called Jessica and asked her to meet me for coffee the next morning. Not at a family gathering or formal meeting, but just the two of us in a neutral location where we could have an honest conversation about what was really happening. She agreed immediately, probably relieved that I was finally ready to discuss practical solutions to her crisis. What she didn't know was that I was prepared to offer her something she hadn't asked for: the truth about Eleanor's inheritance and a choice about how she wanted to handle her relationship with both the money and the rest of the family. Thursday morning found us at a small cafe near the University of Hartford, surrounded by students and professors, rather than family members with agendas. Jessica looked tired but hopeful, dressed down in jeans and a sweater that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her usual polished presentation. "I'm glad you wanted to talk," she said before I'd even sat down. "I know this whole situation has been stressful for everyone, but especially for you. Having money dropped in your lap when you're not used to thinking about large financial decisions must be overwhelming." I ordered coffee and took a moment to study my sister's face. Behind the familiar features, I could see genuine worry and something that might have been fear. Whatever trouble she was in, it was serious enough to strip away some of her usual performative confidence. "Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. If you had inherited Eleanor's money instead of me, would you have given it to me if I was in financial trouble?" She blinked, clearly not expecting that question. "Of course I would. We're family. Even if it meant giving up your own financial security. Even if it meant changing your entire future. Alex, we're talking about $25,000, not life-changing money." I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the trust documents Margaret had given me the day before. Not the family trust proposal my father had sent, but Eleanor's actual financial records showing the real scope of my inheritance. "What if it wasn't $25,000? I asked, sliding the papers across the table. Jessica glanced down at the documents, and I watched her expression change as she processed the numbers. Her face went pale, then flushed, then settled into a mask of shock that was too genuine to be performance. "This says," she looked up at me, then back down at the papers. "This says $51 million. Eleanor was much wealthier than anyone realized. She lived modestly by choice, but she had been building this trust for decades. The 25 that everyone knows about was just her checking account." Jessica stared at the documents like they might disappear if she looked away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You've been sitting on $51 million while I've been begging you for $25,000. I found out about the trust on Friday. I've been trying to process what it means ever since." "What it means?" Her voice rose sharply enough that other customers turned to look at us. "It means you could solve my problems without even noticing the expense. It means all this drama about family trusts and legal threats has been completely unnecessary." I leaned forward and kept my voice calm. "It also means that Eleanor left me enough money to change my entire life, and our family immediately started pressuring me to give it away for someone else's benefit." Jessica sat back in her chair, and I could see her mind working through the implications. "They don't know, do they? Mom and Dad, Uncle Frank, none of them know about the real amount." "No, and Eleanor specifically warned me that the family would try to claim whatever she left me if they knew the true scope of it." "So what are you saying? That you're not going to help me because of some paranoid warning from a 92-year-old woman who barely knew any of us?" The casual dismissal of Eleanor's judgment sparked something defensive in my chest. Eleanor knew us well enough to predict exactly how this conversation would go. She knew the family would see my inheritance as community property rather than personal gift. Jessica's expression shifted from shock to calculation, and I realized I was watching her recalibrate her approach in real time. Alex, I'm your sister. Yes, I made mistakes with my business, but I'm family in a way that Eleanor never was. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for a lot. That's why I'm giving you a choice that no one else is going to get. I pulled out a second document, one I'd had Margaret prepare that morning. I'm willing to pay off your debts completely. Not loan you money, not make you go through family trust committees, just solve the problem outright. But there are conditions. Jessica's eyes widened as she realized what I was offering. What kind of conditions? First, you have to be completely honest with me about the extent of your financial problems. No more vague references to complicated situations. I want numbers, names, timeline, everything. She nodded quickly, clearly willing to trade transparency for financial rescue. Second, you have to agree to financial counseling and debt management planning. I'm not giving you money just so you can make the same mistakes again in 6 months. That's reasonable. Third, and this is the important one, you can't tell the rest of the family about the real size of my inheritance. If you accept my help, you have to let them go on believing that I inherited $25,000 and that solving your problems depleted most of it. Jessica frowned, clearly not understanding why this condition mattered. Why would you want them to think you're broke? Because Eleanor was right about what would happen if they knew the truth. Instead of pressuring me to help you, they'd start pressuring me to help everyone. Uncle Frank's business expansions, Michael's gambling debts, whatever financial dreams or crises come up next. I watched Jessica process this, seeing her understand for the first time that my inheritance represented not just opportunity but also burden. With $51 million came $51 million worth of expectations from people who saw family relationship as justification for financial claims. And if I don't accept your conditions, then you can go back to the family trust proposal and try to convince me to give up control of my inheritance for $25,000 that won't actually solve your problems anyway. Jessica was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions she hadn't known she needed to ask. When she finally looked up, her expression was more serious than I'd seen it in years. The total debt is actually closer to $40,000, she said quietly. 25 would have covered the most urgent payment, but there are other creditors who aren't as immediately dangerous. It was the first completely honest thing she'd said about her financial situation, and I felt something loosen in my chest. What kind of timeline are we talking about for getting everything settled? If I could pay off everything at once, I could probably negotiate settlements for 60 or 70 cents on the dollar. Maybe $50,000 total would clear everything and give me enough working capital to start over with legitimate financing. $50,000. Less than 0.1% of my inheritance, but enough to solve Jessica's crisis completely and give her a genuine fresh start. It was exactly the kind of problem that Eleanor's money could solve without creating larger problems down the road. I can do that, I said. But I want the financial counseling agreement in writing, and I want updates on your progress rebuilding your business with legitimate investors and lenders. Jessica nodded, and for the first time since this whole situation began, she looked genuinely grateful rather than entitled. Alex, I know I haven't been fair to you through all this. I got so focused on my own problems that I didn't think about what inheriting money might feel like for you, especially with the family pressure. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was closer to accountability than I'd expected from her. I just need to know that if I help you, it's really helping. Not just delaying the same crisis for 6 months. It's helping, and Alex, thank you for trusting me with the truth about Eleanor's inheritance. I understand now why you needed time to think about everything. As we left the cafe, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between Jessica and me. By offering her genuine help, rather than just giving in to family pressure, I'd created space for an adult relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation and resentment. But I also knew that the hardest conversation was still ahead of me. Tonight, I would have to tell my parents that I wasn't signing their family trust agreement, and I would have to do it without revealing why their $25,000 calculation was off by a factor of more than 2,000. That evening, I drove back to Maple Street for what I suspected would be my last family dinner for a while. My parents were expecting me to arrive with signed trust documents and a commitment to their vision of collective family financial management. Instead, I was bringing a decision that would prioritize Eleanor's wishes over family expectations, regardless of the consequences. The dining room was set for 4, suggesting that this was intended to be a more intimate conversation than the previous night's family meeting.
My father had clearly calculated that smaller numbers would create more pressure and less opportunity for me to deflect questions or delay decisions. "We're so pleased you decided to move forward with the trust arrangement," my mother said as she served dinner. "It shows real maturity and family commitment." I waited until everyone was seated and had started eating before responding. "Actually, I've decided not to sign the trust agreement." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's face went through a series of expressions that settled on confused disappointment. "I don't understand," my father said carefully. "We thought you agreed that the trust structure made sense for everyone involved." I said I would consider it. "After reviewing the documents with a financial advisor, I've decided it's not the right choice for me." "What financial advisor?" His tone sharpened slightly. "Alex, you don't have the kind of assets that require professional financial management." I thought about Margaret Harrison's office, about Eleanor's detailed planning, about the investment advisors and tax specialists who manage portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. I've been working with Eleanor's bank to understand the full scope of her estate planning. Eleanor's estate planning involved leaving you $25,000. That doesn't require complex financial advisement. I took a deep breath and made a choice that I knew would change everything. I've decided to use the inheritance to help Jessica directly, rather than through a family trust structure. Her debts will be paid off by the end of the week. My parents exchanged glances, clearly trying to process how $25,000 could completely solve Jessica's problems when she'd been describing a much more serious financial crisis. "That's very generous," my mother said slowly, "but what about your own financial security? If you spend Eleanor's entire bequest on Jessica's debts, you'll have nothing left for emergencies or future planning." "I'll be fine. I have a steady job, health insurance, and a pension plan." Jessica needed the money more than I did. My father leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who suspected he wasn't getting the complete story. "Alex, the numbers don't add up. Jessica's problems are more extensive than $25,000 can solve. We worked out a settlement arrangement that makes the money go further than you might expect." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I was walking a careful line between honesty and the kind of selective disclosure that Eleanor had used to protect her real assets from family scrutiny. "So the money is gone?" my mother asked. "Eleanor's entire inheritance. It's being used exactly the way I think Eleanor would have wanted. To help family when they really need it, without creating ongoing obligations or complex financial entanglements." My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you made this decision without consulting the family? Without considering how it affects everyone else's financial planning?" "It was my inheritance to make decisions about." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My father set down his silverware with the careful precision that usually preceded his most serious business conversations. "Alex, I think you may have been influenced by grief and inexperience into making a decision you're going to regret. Eleanor's money was never just about you. It was about family legacy, about maintaining connections between generations. Eleanor left the money to me specifically, not to the family generally. And now it's gone, spent on problems that could have been solved through more thoughtful planning." His voice carried the disappointed tone he used when he thought someone had failed to live up to their potential. "I hope helping Jessica was worth giving up your own financial future." I thought about the $50 million still sitting in investment accounts, about the properties and securities I'd discovered in Eleanor's safety deposit box, about the financial future that was actually more secure than I'd ever dreamed possible. I think it was the right choice. My mother made one final attempt at bridge building. "Well, what's done is done, and Jessica is family, so helping her is helping all of us in a way. I just hope she appreciates the sacrifice you've made." As dinner wound down, I realized that my parents genuinely believed I had given away my only inheritance to solve my sister's problems. They were disappointed in my decision-making, concerned about my financial naivety, and resigned to the fact that Eleanor's money was no longer available for family planning purposes. What they didn't understand was that I had made exactly the choice Eleanor had hoped I would make. I had helped Jessica because I chose to, not because family pressure had manipulated me into compliance. I had maintained control over my inheritance while solving a real problem for someone I cared about. And I had protected the bulk of Eleanor's gift from becoming a source of ongoing family conflict. As I drove home that night, I thought about Eleanor's letter and her hope that I would use her inheritance to become the person I'd always had the potential to be. By standing up to family pressure and making my own choices about how to use her gift, I felt like I had taken the first step toward the kind of independence she had envisioned for me. The next morning brought a text from Jessica, "That's settled. Starting fresh. Thank you for believing in me." And later that day, a call from Margaret Harrison. "Eleanor would be proud of how you handled everything. You've honored both the letter and the spirit of her intentions." But it was Eleanor's ring on my finger that reminded me most clearly of what I'd learned through this entire experience. Family wasn't just about blood relations or inherited obligations. It was about choosing to care for people who saw you clearly and supported your growth. Whether that was a sister who was finally ready to take responsibility for her mistakes or a great-aunt who had trusted you with both her money and her faith in your judgment, Eleanor had given me more than financial security. She had given me the tools to define family on my own terms, and the confidence to use those tools wisely. As I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the life I'd chosen rather than the one that had been expected of me, I finally understood what she meant about building where no one thought anything could grow. The Thompson family would never know that their careful planning and emotional manipulation had been deployed against an inheritance worth $51 million rather than $25,000. They would go on believing that I had sacrificed my financial future for Jessica's problems, and I would let them maintain that fiction as long as it protected the freedom Eleanor had given me to chart my own course. Sometimes the most powerful choice isn't what you reveal, but what you choose to keep private. Eleanor had understood that, and now finally, so did I. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of a renovated brownstone in downtown Hartford, watching a group of high school students present their business plans to a panel of local entrepreneurs. The New England Youth Innovation Academy had started as an idea scribbled in my journal during those sleepless nights after Eleanor's funeral, when I was trying to imagine what I might do with unexpected freedom and unlimited resources. Now it was a reality, funded by a modest portion of Eleanor's trust and staffed by educators who shared my belief that creativity and critical thinking could transform young lives. The student presenting currently was Maria Santos, a 17-year-old from East Hartford, whose proposal for a community garden network had impressed the selection committee enough to earn her a spot in our inaugural program. She spoke with the kind of passionate clarity that reminded me why I'd become a teacher in the first place, describing how her project could address food insecurity while teaching urban agriculture and small business management to neighborhood teenagers. The initial investment would be minimal, Maria explained, clicking through slides she'd created herself, but the community
impact could be substantial. We're not just growing vegetables, we're growing leadership skills, environmental awareness, and economic opportunity in neighborhoods that need all three. I watched the entrepreneurs on the panel exchange impressed glances. Dr. Patricia Williams, who ran a successful consulting firm, leaned forward with obvious interest. James Morrison, whose technology startup had been acquired by a Fortune 500 company, was taking detailed notes. These weren't people who gave encouragement lightly, and their engagement with Maria's presentation spoke to both her talent and the program's potential. The academy operated from a building I'd purchased 6 months earlier, a gorgeous 1920s structure that had been a private school before falling into disrepair. With careful renovation, it had become exactly what I'd envisioned, a space where motivated students could pursue intensive learning experiences that weren't available in traditional public schools. We offered summer programs, after-school initiatives, and weekend workshops focused on entrepreneurship, creative writing, environmental science, and social innovation. The funding came from what Margaret Harrison diplomatically called strategic philanthropy, using Eleanor's inheritance to create something meaningful while maintaining the careful privacy that protected the full scope of my wealth from family attention. To anyone who asked, I explained the Academy as a collaborative project involving multiple donors and grant sources, which was technically true even if I was the primary financial backer. My family had gradually adjusted to what they perceived as my post-inheritance circumstances. They believed I'd spent Eleanor's bequest helping Jessica, and now lived modestly on my teacher's salary while pursuing educational projects in my spare time. My father occasionally made comments about my idealistic phase, but he'd stopped pressuring me about financial decisions once he thought I had no significant assets to manage. Jessica had kept her word about both the debt repayment and the secrecy agreement. Her new business venture, a sustainable fashion consulting firm, was growing steadily with legitimate investors and careful financial management. She'd even started volunteering with some of the Academy's workshops, sharing her hard-earned expertise about fashion industry realities with students interested in creative careers. The most unexpected development had been my mother's response to the Academy. She'd initially been skeptical about what she called my hobby project, but after visiting during our first student showcase, she'd become genuinely enthusiastic about the program's mission.
She now served on our community advisory board and had used her social connections to arrange internship opportunities for several of our students. Miss Thompson, Maria said as her presentation concluded, "I wanted to thank you for creating this program. Most adults don't take teenage ideas seriously, but you've given us space to actually develop our concepts and test them in the real world." I smiled, remembering Eleanor's conviction that investment in young minds was the most reliable way to improve the future. "The ideas were always there, Maria. We just provided a platform for you to develop them properly." After the presentations concluded and the students left to celebrate their successful completion of the summer intensive, I walked through the academy building, checking on the various program spaces we'd created. The Maker Lab, where students learned 3D printing and product design. The media studio, equipped for video production and podcast recording. The greenhouse on the roof, where urban agriculture projects flourished. The library, stocked with resources on social entrepreneurship and community development. Each room represented a piece of Eleanor's vision for how wealth could be used constructively. She'd often talked about the responsibility that came with inherited money, the obligation to create value rather than simply preserving assets. The academy felt like the most authentic expression of her values I could have imagined. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Harrison, annual trust reviews scheduled for Thursday 2 p.m. Remarkable growth this year. Eleanor would be thrilled with both the financial performance and the academy's success. The trust had indeed performed remarkably well under professional management. Conservative estimates suggested the portfolio was now worth closer to $60 million, growing faster than I could have spent it even with the academy's operating expenses and my gradual increase in personal lifestyle choices. I'd moved to a larger apartment with better light for reading and a proper home office. I'd started traveling during school breaks, visiting some of the places Eleanor had described from her own adventures. I'd even bought a reliable car to replace my aging Honda, though I'd deliberately chosen something practical rather than ostentatious. The financial growth meant I could expand the academy's programming without worrying about long-term sustainability. We were already planning a second location in New Haven, and I'd been approached by educators in Boston and Providence about replicating the model in their cities. What had started as a way to honor Eleanor's memory was becoming a regional network with genuine impact on educational opportunities for motivated young people. Thursday's meeting with Margaret took place in the same conference room where I'd first learned about the trust's actual value. The mahogany table was covered with quarterly reports, investment summaries, and strategic planning documents that painted a picture of financial health that still seemed surreal to me. "The technology sector investments have performed particularly well," Margaret explained, pointing to charts that showed consistent growth across multiple holdings. "Eleanor's original strategy of diversified long-term positions continues to generate excellent returns." I reviewed the numbers with the kind of attention Eleanor had taught me during our conversations about responsible wealth management. She'd been clear that inheriting money was only the beginning of financial responsibility, that maintaining and growing assets required ongoing education and careful decision-making. "The academy's operating budget represents less than 2% of annual portfolio growth," Margaret continued. "You could expand programming significantly without affecting the trust's long-term stability." "What about the Boston and Providence expansion ideas?" "Completely feasible from a financial standpoint. The question is whether you want to take on the additional administrative complexity of managing multiple locations." I'd been thinking about that exact question for weeks. The academy's success had created opportunities I hadn't anticipated, but it had also created demands on my time and energy that went far beyond my original vision of supporting local students during summers and weekends. "I've been considering stepping back from full-time teaching," I admitted. "Focusing entirely on the academy, and potentially developing a training program for educators who want to start similar initiatives in their communities." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Eleanor always hoped the inheritance would give you freedom to pursue your interests without financial constraints. It sounds like you're ready to embrace that freedom more fully." Leaving my teaching position felt like a bigger decision than any financial choice I'd made since inheriting Eleanor's trust. Teaching had defined my professional identity for years, providing structure and purpose even when the pay was modest and the resources were limited. But the academy had shown me possibilities for educational impact that went beyond any single classroom. That evening, I sat in Eleanor's garden behind the Greenwich house, which I'd decided to keep rather than sell.
The estate sale had dispersed most of her furniture and household items, but I'd preserved the garden and the main living spaces, creating a retreat where I could think clearly about important decisions. The roses Eleanor had loved were blooming again, tended by a gardening service that understood her preferences for informal abundance over formal structure. I'd added a small writing studio in what used to be her art storage room, a quiet space where I could work on academy planning and the education policy articles I'd started publishing in professional journals. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with genuine curiosity about what prompted an evening call. "Alex, I have something I need to tell you," she said without preamble. "I've been asked to speak at a conference about sustainable business practices, and part of my presentation is about how family support made it possible for me to rebuild after my financial crisis." I felt a flutter of anxiety. "What kind of details are you planning to share?" "Nothing specific about amounts or sources. But I want to acknowledge publicly that I couldn't have recovered without help from someone who believed in my potential even when I'd given them no reason to." The careful phrasing suggested she understood the importance of maintaining our privacy agreement while still acknowledging the role my assistance had played in her recovery. "I think that sounds appropriate," I said. Eleanor always believed that helping family should strengthen relationships rather than create obligations. Speaking of Eleanor, Jessica said, her tone shifting slightly, "I've been thinking about visiting her grave on the anniversary of her death next month. I know I wasn't as attentive to her as I should have been, but I'd like to pay my respects. Would you want to join me?" The offer surprised me. Jessica had shown little interest in Eleanor during her lifetime, and I'd assumed that pattern would continue after her death. But people changed, sometimes in ways that previous behavior didn't predict. "I'd like that," I said. "I think Eleanor would appreciate knowing that her family remembers her, even if the relationships weren't perfect." After ending the call, I walked through Eleanor's house, turning on lights in rooms that had been dark for months. The building felt different now that I was its owner rather than just a frequent visitor, less like a museum preserving someone else's life and more like a space that could accommodate new purposes while honoring old memories. I'd been thinking about converting part of the house into a retreat center for academy students, a place where they could spend intensive weekends working on ambitious projects or collaborating with peers from other programs. The library and art collection could provide inspiration, while the gardens offered space for reflection and outdoor learning experiences. The next morning, I submitted my resignation letter to the Hartford School District, effective at the end of the academic year. The principal, Dr. Susan Chen, had been expecting this conversation ever since the academy's success had started attracting regional attention. "We hate to lose you," she said, as we discussed transition planning, "but we're proud of what you've accomplished with the academy. It's exactly the kind of innovative educational programming that public schools struggle to provide with traditional funding constraints. I'm hoping to develop partnerships with districts like ours," I replied. "The academy model works best when it complements rather than competes with public education." The conversation led to discussions about potential collaborations that could bring academy programming directly into public schools, using my resources to support innovation within existing systems rather than replacing them entirely. It was the kind of systemic thinking Eleanor had encouraged, looking for ways to create broad impact rather than just helping individual students. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the Academy's first graduation ceremony. 15 students who'd completed our year-long intensive program presented their final projects to an audience of family members, community leaders, and potential mentors from local businesses and nonprofits. Maria Santos announced her acceptance to MIT with a full scholarship, where she planned to study urban planning and environmental engineering. Her community garden network had attracted funding from 3 different sources and was expanding to 5 neighborhoods across Hartford. 2 other students had launched businesses based on projects they'd developed through our entrepreneurship track. Several more had been recruited by internship programs, with companies that valued the kind of creative problem-solving skills we emphasized. But the student who moved me most was David Park, whose presentation wasn't about business success or college acceptance, but about personal transformation. David had arrived at the academy as a shy sophomore who'd never imagined himself as a leader or innovator. Through our creative writing and social advocacy programs, he'd discovered a voice and a mission, developing a peer mentoring initiative that was already being adopted by his high school. "A year ago, I thought intelligence meant knowing the right answers," David said during his presentation.
The academy taught me that intelligence means asking better questions and having the courage to pursue answers even when they lead you somewhere unexpected. After the ceremony, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Williams from our advisory board. She'd been one of our earliest supporters, contributing both funding and expertise to help establish the program's credibility. "I've been watching your model carefully," she said, "and I think you're onto something that could transform how we think about gifted and talented education. Most programs focus on acceleration, pushing bright students through material faster. You're focusing on depth and application, letting them pursue their interests with real-world impact." Eleanor always said that intelligence without purpose was just an expensive hobby, I replied. "We're trying to help students find purposes worthy of their abilities." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered writing a book about the Academy's approach? The education field needs new models, and your results speak for themselves." The idea intrigued me. I'd been documenting our methods and outcomes for internal evaluation, but I hadn't considered sharing our approach more broadly through publication. A book could reach educators who would never have the resources to visit our programs directly, potentially multiplying our impact beyond anything we could achieve through direct service alone. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the Academy's first-year data. Student engagement surveys, learning outcome assessments, college admission results, and long-term goal tracking all painted a picture of educational programming that was achieving exactly what Eleanor and I had envisioned. But more than the quantitative measures, it was the qualitative changes I found most compelling. Students who'd never seen themselves as leaders were starting organizations and taking on community challenges. Young people who'd been bored by traditional academic approaches were discovering passion for learning when it connected to real-world problem-solving. Teenagers who'd felt isolated by their interests were finding communities of peers who shared their intensity and ambition. The Academy had become more than an educational program. It had become a demonstration of what was possible when young people were trusted with meaningful opportunities and supported with adequate resources. Eleanor's money had made it possible, but the students themselves had made it extraordinary. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at Eleanor's ring on my finger and thought about the conversation we'd had in her garden about inheritance and responsibility. She'd been concerned that traditional inheritance patterns rewarded accident of birth, rather than character or contribution. Through the Academy, I felt like I was using her gift to reward merit and potential instead, creating opportunities for students who earned them through talent and effort, rather than family connections. The next morning brought an email that changed everything I thought I knew about Eleanor's planning. Margaret Harrison forwarded a message from a law firm in Switzerland, indicating that additional assets had been located in international accounts that Eleanor had established decades earlier. The message was formal and vague, requesting a conference call to discuss matters related to the Whitfield estate that require immediate attention. I stared at the email, wondering what Eleanor could possibly have arranged that hadn't been covered in her meticulously planned American estate. The Swiss firm suggested a complexity to her financial affairs that went beyond anything Margaret had discussed, implying resources or obligations that had been carefully hidden even from her primary wealth management team. The conference call was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the intervening days oscillating between curiosity and anxiety about what Eleanor might have arranged as a final surprise. She'd already given me more than I could have imagined possible. What else could there be? On Thursday morning, I sat in Margaret's office with the speakerphone connected to Geneva, where a precisely accented voice explained that Eleanor had maintained investment accounts in Switzerland for 40 years, managed by a firm that specialized in discretionary international portfolios for American expatriates and their heirs. The accounts were structured as irrevocable trusts with delayed disclosure provisions, the Swiss advisor explained. Miss Whitfield's instructions specified that we were not to contact her American representatives until 18 months after her death, to ensure that her primary estate planning had been completed without complications. Margaret and I exchanged glances. Eleanor had created a second layer of inheritance, hidden even from her primary financial team, and triggered only after I'd had time to adjust to the initial trust arrangement. What is the approximate value of these accounts? Margaret asked. As of today's valuation, approximately $97 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $97 million. Combined with the American Trust, Eleanor had left me close to $150 million, an amount so large it ceased to feel like money, and started to feel like responsibility, on a scale I'd never imagined. Miss Whitfield left specific instructions regarding the use of these additional funds, the Swiss advisor continued. She designated them for large-scale philanthropic initiatives, with particular emphasis on educational innovation and community development programs. Eleanor had created what amounted to a private foundation, with me as the sole trustee and decision-maker. She'd given me not just financial security, but the tools to make the kind of systemic impact that individual generosity could never achieve. After the call ended, I sat in Margaret's office trying to process what I'd learned. The academy, which I'd thought represented a significant commitment of Eleanor's resources, was actually just the beginning of what she'd made possible. "What would you like to do with this information?" Margaret asked gently. I thought about the academy's success, about the students who'd discovered their potential through programming that Eleanor's initial trust had funded, about the expansion opportunities that had seemed ambitious when I'd imagined them drawing from $60 million, but which looked entirely feasible with $150 million at my disposal. I think Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing, I said finally. She gave me time to learn how to use wealth responsibly on a small scale before trusting me with resources that could create real systemic change. Margaret nodded. She was remarkably strategic in her planning, everything designed to maximize both your success and your impact. As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that Eleanor's final gift wasn't just the money, enormous as it was. It was the confidence she'd shown in my judgment, the trust she'd placed in my ability to use her resources wisely, and for purposes larger than my own comfort. The academy had been my training ground, teaching me how to translate financial resources into educational opportunities. Now Eleanor was asking me to think bigger, to consider how those same principles might transform educational access not just in Hartford, but across the region, and potentially beyond. That evening, I called Jessica to share the news about Eleanor's additional trust, knowing that our relationship had evolved enough to handle this kind of transparency. $150 million, she repeated slowly. Alex, that's not an inheritance anymore. That's a foundation. That's generational impact money. I know, and I think that's exactly what Eleanor intended. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Are you scared? Terrified, I admitted, but also excited. Eleanor believed I could handle this responsibility, and I want to prove her right. You already have, Jessica said firmly. The academy is proof that you know how to use resources to create opportunity, rather than just accumulating wealth. Eleanor chose well. 6 months later, I stood before the board of directors of the Whitfield Educational Foundation, presenting our 5-year strategic plan for expanding innovative educational programming across New England. The board included educators, business leaders, and community advocates who shared Eleanor's vision of education as the most reliable pathway to individual and social transformation. Our first initiative beyond the original academy was already under construction, a residential summer program for students from rural communities who lacked access to intensive educational opportunities. The second was a teacher training institute that would prepare educators to implement academy-style programming within traditional public school systems. The foundation's endowment would ensure that both programs could operate indefinitely, creating sustainable impact that would outlive my own involvement. Eleanor's money was becoming Eleanor's legacy, transformed from static wealth into dynamic opportunity for generations of students who would never know her name, but would benefit from her vision. As I looked around the conference table at people who'd committed their expertise to advancing Eleanor's educational mission, I realized that she'd given me something more valuable than financial security, or even philanthropic resources. She'd given me a life that mattered, work that created lasting value, and the satisfaction that came from using privilege constructively. The academy's current students would graduate knowing that their achievements had opened doors for peers they'd never meet. The foundation's programs would demonstrate that innovative education was possible at scale when adequate resources met committed leadership. And somewhere in towns and cities across New England, young people were discovering potential they'd never known they possessed, because an elderly woman had chosen to invest in their futures rather than simply preserving her assets. Eleanor had been right about inheritance. Family wasn't just about blood relations or traditional obligations. It was about choosing to care for people whose potential deserved investment. Whether that was a great niece who needed encouragement to stand up for herself or thousands of students who needed opportunities to develop their ability. The ring on my finger caught the light from the conference room windows, reminding me of Eleanor's note about love taking many forms. Through the foundation, her love was becoming educational opportunity. Through the academy, her faith in my judgment was becoming confidence for young people who'd learned to trust their own abilities. Through the choices I made with her resources, her quiet life was becoming a loud argument for what wealth could accomplish when it was guided by purpose rather than just accumulated for its own sake. That evening, I visited Eleanor's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple, bearing only her name and dates, but the flowers surrounding it spoke of lives she'd touched in ways both large and small. I placed a photo of the Academy's first graduating class beside the roses, along with a copy of our foundation's mission statement. "Thank you," I said aloud, feeling simultaneously foolish and grateful for the chance to speak to her one final time, for trusting me with this responsibility, for believing I could grow into it, for giving me the chance to discover who I could become when money wasn't something I had to worry about. The October wind scattered leaves across the cemetery grounds, and I pulled my jacket closer against the autumn chill. But inside, I felt the warmth that came from work that mattered, relationships that had deepened through challenge, and the kind of security that came not from accumulating wealth, but from using it wisely. Eleanor had given me more than I could spend in a lifetime. But more importantly, she'd given me a lifetime worth spending well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.